Yeah, just my take on things. My answer to number 2. Guided discovery, identifying, challenging your beliefs, reframing your mind, negative thoughts release.
Welcome everybody to another wonderful episode of Peplow's Ghost. So appreciative of everyone listening here, and I'm so excited to be introducing our next guest, Ms. Chris McCormick-Pries. It really is kind of a coming back to home type of episode for me, so I might get a little sappy on this podcast, and I know Kate and Sean are here to kind of keep me in line with that, but really appreciate Chris and spending time, and again, for all of you listening, to make sure that you're all kind of keeping this podcast afloat. So the only podcast I know that's about PMHNPs with no commercials. Although I'd love to have some commercials someday, so not opposed to getting paid. So let me do a quick introduction for Chris McCormick-Pries. She is a PMHNP. I believe she's also one of the, which we've got others on this podcast right now too, a PMH-CNS, which is a certified nurse specialist. Been in practice for a while. I don't want to make Chris feel old, and I don't want to make myself feel old in saying this too. But I was reading kind of a little bit. She's been in practice for over 40 years. So I'm really appreciate she's going to share some of her wealth of experience. We just honored her at the University of Iowa with our 2024 College of Nursing Notable Preceptor Award. That's the one preceptor we identify out of all the programs that's doing amazing work. And so I was fortunate enough to hand her that award and share a couple of humorous stories with her. So that was a great day as well. But the other thing that's, like I said, it's kind of a coming back to home is that this Chris was my preceptor back in the day. And so I always like to I found a quote online before we get to that, that Chris was described, and I love this wording, just Chris has a beautiful energy that lights a fire in nearly every person she encounters. That was just really great. So, which I agree. I think she's just got that kind of personality that people are attracted to and just kind of want to know more about. So, so the first question I always like to ask Chris is, do you remember the first time we met?
You know, I don't, and I've heard you ask other people that, and I have been pounding my brain. I think it was before you were a student.
Yeah, so, kind of taking a little bit back just to kind of share, Chris is kind of one of the first nurses, advanced practice in our community here, and her and Judy Collins were kind of very close and kind of working with children and adolescents, and so Judy kind of took me under her wing a little bit and introduced me to you as well. That's kind of the first time. So, right. But yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. And so my first question kind of about the podcast is, when did you first get interested in doing psychotherapy?
You know, I think from the very beginning, I was really struck when Dr. Cynthia Handrup was on your podcast. Her journey and my journey are very similar. All my training was psychotherapy. So, you are very gracious not to mention my age and how long I've been working, but I graduated from nursing school in 1971, University of Maryland, immediately went back to New York, which was where my family had been from, and worked on a psych unit. And I worked at Jacobi Hospital. And even as a staff nurse, talking to those patients who were part of our patient load was very important. And that's really the beginning of psychotherapy, as far as I'm concerned. Learning how to become comfortable and communicate, and learning how to be present and to be attentive and to be detail oriented. Now, I didn't have a background of 6 theoretical frameworks with which I could interpret all of what I was hearing and talking with folks about. But that was our foundation. I mean, that's what nurses did. That's what psychiatric nurses did. We were there to really engage in relationship. And I think, Dan, you know, as I have seen students year after year after year, I say to them, the most important thing you need to do with a patient is build a relationship. No relationship, no movement forward. And, we are given the gift of many different means of psychotherapy to build that relationship. But that's where psychotherapy really started for me. Then, obviously, after working a year there, I was engaged, and the individual I was engaged to was a physician who was in the U.S. Public Health Service, and he was stationed in Rock Island, Illinois. So, he moved out here, and then I moved out here, and I then started teaching at a community college and started learning more about psychotherapeutic interaction and process and frameworks and, different modes of psychotherapy, and became interested in graduate school. And I was so blessed to go to graduate school in the early 1970s. I got a traineeship. I got paid to go to graduate school. As I hear my students tell the story of student loan and student debt, I continue to be so grateful for what my opportunities were, which was to be able to go to school and get paid to do that. So I didn't have to work. I could concentrate and focus. Sorry, that's my dog. I could concentrate and focus everything, all my energy, on really being a student and learning everything I could. So University of Iowa, that's where I went to school, was the University of Iowa. And of course, we were very psychotherapy oriented, taking a class and a course, individual psychotherapy, family psychotherapy, group psychotherapy. And, first began engaging with our patients in psychotherapy. But I think, now that you asked me that question, I think really the first form of psychotherapy I ever did was that IPR that we used to do in nursing school, where you had to write down your interaction with individuals. So, it started at the very beginning. It's a long answer to a very succinct question.
No, it's good. I like the background and things. Just so people are listening, IPR stands for?
Interpersonal recording.
Thank you. Yeah, good. Awesome.
All right. So Chris, I share some of your lineage. I'm also a dual trained CNS NP. So I appreciate your passion for psychotherapy. Dan asked you a question kind of more globally about your relationship with psychotherapy. I like to follow up usually with a question that kind of laser focuses on an experience with psychotherapy. I don't know about you, but sometimes in my interactions with patients, not because of what I do, but more because of what happens in the relationship, it sometimes feels like lightning in a bottle. So I'm asking you to think for a moment, was there a particular experience or encounter in psychotherapy that made you realize that, oh my goodness, this is something really special?
I worked with an adolescent, probably in the early 80s, and I was paired up with a physician, Dr. Lois Hokanson, and I don't know if you remember her, Dan. But I was doing psychotherapy with this particularly difficult adolescent who was hostile and angry and hurt and traumatized and wanted no part of a relationship with me at all. And I can remember Dr. Hokanson continuing to remind me how important it was to be present and to just acknowledge her pain. And after about 3 or 4 months in psychotherapy, there became obvious a dramatic change. It wasn't that dramatic, but she really engaged with me and opened up. And I think for the first time felt that there was someone who was listening to her and helping her sort through what her thoughts and feelings were about circumstances that had happened to her. And interestingly, here we are, decades later, I still hear from her periodically.
That's awesome.
And hear from her how important psychotherapy was to her.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
And it really cemented for me, again, the importance of the relationship and the focus on the individual in the relationship.
Yeah. What a beautiful example. Thank you for sharing that. And Chris, you mentioned at the beginning, how lucky we are to have so many modalities of psychotherapy at our disposal to build these relationships with patients. We'd love to hear a little bit about any specific forms or types of psychotherapy that you're drawn to.
Well, early on, I was very involved in interpersonal psychotherapy. Now, working in New York in the 70s, Hildegard Peplau was right across the river in New Jersey. So the interpersonal theory of nursing and all of the things that she had to say. And then I was very, very lucky to be able to go to the Sullivanian Institute for individual psychotherapy, the William Allenson White Institute in New York for a year. So that focus was very interpersonal. Coming out to Iowa was quite a shock because at the time, Iowa was very biological. I don't know if you remember that, Dan, but a long time ago, very biological. So I really struggled with the modality of psychotherapy at that point because everybody I was working with was focused on different things. But I began to learn more about, rational emotive therapy, CBT, and then I was trained by Nancy Bloom at the University of Iowa in the STEPS program, which is a DBT program. That has now become my love. And even in medication checks, I am saying to people, tell me about your thoughts. How do you challenge them? How do you redirect them? How do you replace them? We talk about emotional regulation, mindfulness, all those kinds of things. But the content of the DBT program from the STEPS manual has really become almost a Bible for me. I love it. And it's easy to incorporate pieces of it in a med check.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's one of those things, even going back to that example of, interacting with that kid and still seeing him as an adult, you never know when you create a memory, right? I mean, it's always
Absolutely.
one of those things. And that's the gift. Like I think you've been saying too, it's kind of the gift that we have as our role. We get to interact with these people and see them grow. I mean, I'll never forget kind of when I interviewed actually for my DMP program. It was actually a non-psych person interviewing me and asked the question I'll never forget, saying, do people get better in psych? And I was kind of set back like, oh, yeah, they do. I'm surprised by that question, but yeah, I think, and I appreciate you kind of giving a plug for Hildegard Peplau. Obviously, that's kind of the mother of psych mental health nursing and the name of our podcast here. So kind of going back to that, how do you see nursing? Because I think you've kind of been, for me at least, again, hopefully I don't get a little verklempt, but you've been for me kind of the ideal nurse and how to be a psych mental health advanced practice nurse. And so how do you see nursing being a leader in performing psychotherapy? Because obviously other professions can do that skill as well, but how do you see nursing as being kind of central or part of, what we do basically?
Well, first of all, I think as nurses first and advanced practice nurses second, we have a wealth of knowledge about health and about illness and about environment and the social determinants of health that I believe, unfortunately, many of our colleagues do not have. So I think we come into our relationships with a much broader base of knowledge and a much more advantageous perspective on really assessing and intervening with the individuals that we're working with. I mean, for years, and this, Dan, I mean, my certification was in child and adolescent psychiatric mental health nursing. So all my early years, my first 25, 30 years of working were with children and adolescents. They all grow up. So now I see them as adults or I see their kids. But understanding development, understanding child health, understanding nutrition, understanding all of those things is so important to helping children. Kids that wiggle and move in school are not all children who have ADHD. Some of them drink too much caffeine. Some of them have worms. Some of them don't get enough sleep. Some of them are uncomfortable because of something else. You have to have a broader perspective. So that is what I believe the gift of nursing gives to us as psychotherapists. We go into it with a much broader base by which we can, as I said, assess and intervene what's happening. And I think, therefore, we should be leaders in the field of psychotherapy. Unfortunately, because of our knowledge about biology and medicine and the reduction of psychiatrists, we're slotted into becoming chemists. And we are so much more than that. And by the way, all the chemical knowledge we have in the world, all the medicine knowledge we have in the world doesn't work if people don't like us and don't trust us. So without the relationship, we're nowhere. We're nowhere.
Chris, I'm going to shift the focus a little bit in a slightly different direction, and I'm going to ask you a question. I mean, you know very well that, our scope and standards of practice published by the American Nurses Association, the International Society for Psychiatric Nurses, and the American Psychiatric Nurses Association, they establish that we are credentialed to be able to deliver psychotherapy.
Correct.
Looking at the other side of the coin, do you see any risks associated with that standard of practice in terms of how we are turning students out into the market right now?
Boy, that's an interesting and complicated question. I think if the programs do not include psychotherapy, there is a risk because we are partially preparing them. And I think that is a disservice to the student, and I think it's a disservice to the patients that we see. And I think it's the NLN more than the ANA and some of these other organizations that oversee the educational credentialing of programs. But I think we nursing leaders have to be strong and vocal in supporting the inclusion of psychotherapy in the programs that we take students from. So I feel pretty strongly about it, Sean. I think it's like preparing people and tying one hand behind their back. And I think there is a risk associated with that in terms of placing them then in situations where they get stymied and stuck and they don't know what to do with somebody.
Thanks for establishing the genesis of this podcast, Chris.
You're very welcome, Sean. It's my pleasure.
And I'd like to piggyback a little bit on Sean's question. I'm so struck by your incredible wealth of experience and expertise in this field. And I'm curious, Chris, what have you seen or what do you see as the barriers for more psych NPs or advanced practice psych nurses using psychotherapy in practice, and any ideas about how we could address some of those barriers?
And let me say that I say this out of a framework of working in a mental health center. And Dan was gracious in saying 40 years. I've been there 50 years. In May, I will have been at Vera French 50 years. So what I see in terms of the barriers are it's cheaper to hire a social worker than it is to hire an advanced practice nurse. So when you have organizations that are administratively managed by non-nursing individuals, you have folks in administration that do not understand that although a psych nurse may engender a higher salary, he or she is much better prepared to intervene in the distress and the illnesses that patients have, and very often help them reach a higher level of wellness and quality of life more quickly. When you have one person doing psychotherapy and somebody else doing medicine, very often they don't talk to each other. And you've got people working down different tracks and missing things. If that individual is the same person, you're able to really do a combination of things, and I think promote better health and better treatment. I always try when I have patients in a med check and they're seeing a social worker or one of our mental health therapists, I very often say to them, tell me about your psychotherapy. What are the goals of your psychotherapy? And, sometimes they're saying, I'm not sure. What do you and your psychotherapist talk about? Well, we talk about school, we talk about life, we talk about things. And it distresses me sometimes when I hear that they're not focusing on learning skills. I say to patients in a med check, I can prescribe a medicine that helps you feel better in the short run. And perhaps you have a lifelong condition and you will need some maintenance care with medication in that condition. But psychotherapy teaches you tools and skills that will last your whole life. Skills that you can use at any point in your life. And you can pull them out of your toolbox whenever you need them. So those are the arguments, so to speak, or the rationales when I am talking to our administrators, what I say. And, for many years I was on the leadership team. I'm not anymore. I only work part-time. And I advocate strongly to get an advanced practice nurse on that leadership team. I think physicians are wonderful and I love working with them, but we don't have very many here anymore. Many of them are in private practice in the larger cities. I think the other barrier is for many newer professionals in this business, there's an excitement about being able to prescribe a medicine. And psychotherapy is hard work. And as we all know, the excitement is something that it takes some time to understand it and to build it. So I think sometimes we don't give our students the right perspective of what the importance of our positions are and what the importance of our work is. So those are a couple of things. I think there is a financial, initially on first glance, there's a financial incentive to hire someone who costs less. But I'm always saying, what about risk? What about the length of treatment? And what about the fact that often they miss things that they need to be seeing? So, those are conversations we need to have, and hopefully we're allowed to have them in different situations.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, what I try to tell people too is, when you go to therapy, you learn things that you don't need refills on, right? You don't need to get a refill for how you do your CBT or how you do, various types of things. You can just kind of do that and take away those skills, like you mentioned in that example, from adolescence all the way through their life. They can kind of carry those coping skills and fortunately that pharmacy you don't need to, stand in line for. So it's a great thing. So my next question, and we can spend some time too talking about some other things if you want to talk, but the next question we'd like to ask is just to pull out your crystal ball and kind of look into the future. What do you see as a future for using psychotherapy within the psych mental health nurse practitioner role?
Well, I think if we don't teach it, we're not going to use it. So the future depends on whether or not programs include a basis of psychotherapy in their program. So that becomes critical. So we have to continue to be advocates of recognizing how important psychotherapy is and continue to put it in programs and teach it. I think the other piece of that is we need to continue to find preceptors who have experience with psychotherapy, who are willing to mentor their students in psychotherapy. And then the other thing that I have found very important is we as experienced psychiatric nurse practitioners need to be willing to provide supervision and mentorship to new graduates who come into our programs. And we have to continue to encourage them to be engaged in psychotherapy with their patients. So I think those things will have an implication for the future of psychotherapy in the practice of psychiatric nursing. I think the other thing is that we need to continue, and I applaud you, Dan, and I applaud all of you who are involved in professional organizations. We need to continue to remind policymakers how important the role of advanced practice nurses is in all of our fields of nursing, in all of our fields of healthcare, but for us, especially in psychotherapy or in psychiatric nursing. And we need to continue to be at the table having conversations with policymakers about the importance of making these practitioners available and being able to include them in policymaking and in planning.
Yeah,
so I think those things.
Sorry. No. I was going to say, yeah, it's important to kind of just have that seat at the table. I think it's it's something that gets overlooked a lot. I don't know why. I mean, I struggle with that kind of understanding of why sometimes boards and other, organizations that are making policy don't kind of consider nurses as a profession and why they're not getting kind of that seat at the table. So, so that's great. Thank you, Chris. Again, Chris, yes, like I said, tried to kind of minimize your years of practice, but hopefully didn't short sell you. But and I also will share, I know Chris is on her third retirement. I mean, you keep trying to phase out of retirement. I think that's just something I always see for people who are just driven, and this is not a job. This is your life passion. So
well, it's been my vocation. I mean, I truly see this as my vocation. I love what I do. And I hope that being able to transmit how much I love what I do to students will help spark that passion in them. So they too will have a wonderful vocation or career in a field that they love.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. That's a good way to end the podcast. Thank you so much. For those listening, make sure that you like, subscribe, and comment, and look forward to having another episode soon. Thank you so much, Chris McCormick-Pries from Vera French Community Mental Health Center. Thank you as well for Dr. Sean Convoy from Duke and Dr. soon to be Dr. Kate Melino from University of California, San Francisco. So thank you and take care. We'll see you soon in the next episode.
These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Yeah, guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease.